After the trailing arm differential assembly was removed from the frame, it was time to give it some attention. The rotted trailing arm pivot bushings were drilled and then pressed from the leading edge of the trailing arms. Remember those old crusty bolts holding the rear springs to the trailing arms that we removed earlier? Here is where the bolts pass through the trailing arm. It was obvious that there could be some rust between the two halves of each trailing arm, and I wanted to be sure to remove it if it was present. The two halves of each trailing arm were held together by spot welds. I drilled the spot welds to separate the arms. As you can tell, the metal in the trailing arms was tough to drill, but persistence prevailed. Any nasty stuff was then removed. The rear shock lower mounts and axle U-bolts were blasted. I did not like the condition of the U-bolts, so I decided to replace them. The rear axle housing was also cleaned. After the parts were cleaned, they were degreased and metal prepped for painting. Pour 15 paint was used on the newly cleaned parts. Then the arms were bolted back together with stainless steel bolts and torqued. New pivot bushings were then pressed into the trailing arms. I didn't paint the differential cover as I planned to replace it. The differential was opened and all the parts were removed for inspection. All looked fine, so the parts were returned to their home. The spider gears were removed and new spider gears with more spines were inserted to allow the installation of new axles. The differential gear set has a 3.73 ratio. The ring gear was torqued to the carrier assembly. New axle bearings were installed and the new 5-bolt axles were inserted. The new differential cover was installed. The differential was lifted back under the frame and the trailing arm pivot bolts were installed. A new air vent was installed to allow the differential to breathe. This picture shows the assembly attached to the frame. Springs and brakes have also been added in this photo. The new axle U-bolts I received needed some persuasion to fit. As you can see in the photos, the legs of the U-bolts needed to be compressed more closely together to fit into the axle perches on the trailing arms. I finally persuaded them to work. This photo shows the 3-inch lowering spring supporting the trailing arm differential assembly. Still a long way to go to make a running truck.